Hey everybody, my name's Daniel McDonough and I'm happy to be here with you this morning, or maybe afternoon depending on where you live, to do a cello chat. I guess it's going to be kind of an open-ended cello chat. I'm happy to talk with you about whatever issues you want to discuss. It's a very strange time for a musician these days, and I'm broadcasting here from home. In Champaign, Illinois. So you may hear an interruption from one of my three children who are also home. But hopefully they'll be good and stay out of my office. I make my career as a cellist in a string quartet. We're called the Jupiter String Quartet. We've been playing together for about 20 years, almost 20 years, maybe 18 years now. Our career started in Boston, where we studied at the New England Conservatory, actually, with Paul Katz in the professional string quartet training program. And about 7.5 years ago, we moved to Champaign, where the University of Illinois is, and we teach privately here at the university, and we also direct the string chamber music program here. So those are the two main aspects of what I do as a professional cellist. And I was also very lucky to be involved in the founding of the East Coast Chamber Orchestra. So when I first graduated from graduate school in New York, me and a bunch of my friends started the East Coast Chamber Orchestra. So if you have questions that relate to conductorless chamber ensembles that aren't string quartets, that are larger, I might be able to talk to you a little bit about that. Again, I'm here to talk about cello technique, cello repertoire, career, what it's going to be like in the next year. It's hard to say. So many of our concerts have been canceled, and we're also beginning to experiment with what it means to make music in a virtual world. So I'm happy to talk through that with you guys, with the caveat that I'm very green about that issue myself. Here's the first question. What artists have been most influential to you in your life so far? In what ways have they affected your approach to music? That's a really good question. I think as cellists and artists, we learn so much from the people who came before us. I feel like I wouldn't be who I am without my primary teachers. During my undergraduate, I studied with Stephen Gaber, and then I did a master's degree with Tim Eddy at Juilliard, and then Paul Katz was my teacher at NEC and also helped coach the quartet. And each one of those teachers gave me something I think that I feel so fortunate to have. I mean, when I came to Steve Gaber, he was the principal of the Cleveland Orchestra at the time, and he really understood kind of the necessity of kind of establishing the technique, and he was really organized about my technique, like making me do an etude every week, a new etude every week, getting me through a lot of repertoire, sort of understanding the physics of playing the cello. And then Tim was a very deep musician, and he really was very thoughtful in his approach. I mean, he really opened up my ears, made me listen to what I was doing in a way that I hadn't yet figured out how to do. So when I went to him, it was a kind of good time in my life to understand how much deeper my listening could be, how much more beautiful my playing could be if I really focused on listening to myself. And Paul was an amazing quartet cellist in his own day with the Cleveland Quartet. He taught me so much about relaxation, how to be a good quartet cellist, how to provide foundation for the quartet, how to work on my own playing to make the quartet better. He's still a big mentor for me, and I'm really happy to be a part of this website, which he built from the ground up. So, and then the quartet also studied a lot with the Takács Quartet, who were really influential for us when we first started out. So those were my primary mentors. The question that came in: how has your approach to chamber music evolved over your 20-year career with the Jupiter String Quartet? That's another great question. I find that, when you're first figuring out how to work in a democratic way, when you're in your early 20s and you have all this sort of fresh enthusiasm about trying to make it, it can be hard to balance everybody's ideas. There was probably at the beginning of our career way too much talking and not enough listening. These days, I would say we do more playing as we're approaching the end of our second decade. We're more flexible because we're listening more and talking less. We're able to not try to make firm decisions all the time, but we're able to kind of flex a little more than we used to. And I think that's been a really important change for us. It's been kind of freeing, I think, in the way we work together. I see Max is on. Hey Max, how's it going? In what ways does playing professionally in a string quartet affect the way you play and practice individually? Well, that's a really good question. I try to, when I practice my quartet parts, which I did a lot, especially in the early days of playing, I try to practice them with the same kind of commitment that I would practice the Dvorak Concerto or my Bach suites. The same sensitivity of shaping, even if I'm not practicing the melody. I'm trying not to just practice technique of the quartet part. I'm trying to really hear all the other parts, even if my colleagues aren't in the room with me when I'm practicing. And I'm really trying to develop ideas about how it should go, even though I'm only one of four parts. And I would also add, Max, that I think it's crucial, and this is something that Paul talked with me about a lot, Paul and Tim, because the quartet started when I was at Juilliard, to maintain your own playing. Even if you're super passionate about string quartets and you're devoting a lot of time to developing your ensemble, one of the most important things you can do for your ensemble is continue to grow as a cellist. So practicing the standard repertoire, giving each other opportunities to play with other musicians, because when I go out and I play with people who aren't in my string quartet, I learn new things and I bring them back to the quartet. So there's a kind of sharing that happens when you allow your quartet the freedom to take on projects that don't exist inside the quartet, different collaborations. I mean, playing in the East Coast Chamber Orchestra, I think, was really important for learning things from other musicians, from my peers, that I could bring back to the quartet. So that was an ensemble that was 16, 17 string players with no conductor. So there were tons of ideas flying out, and I learned a tremendous amount about cello playing and music from my colleagues. The next question: when you start working on a new obscure piece in a chamber music setting, where do you start? How do you approach it? Especially if you can't find any background information or recordings. That's an excellent question. I think when we learn a Beethoven quartet, it's impossible for us not to have our favorite recording in our ear or have some preconceived notion of how it's supposed to go. And that can be a really good thing. We can learn from what we've heard, and we can build on that. But there are a lot of times where we're faced with new music. I mean, our string quartet is commissioning new pieces all the time. In fact, we're going to premiere one this summer by our dear friend Michi Bianco. She's writing a new piece for us about climate change. So we're going to just have the score in front of us and nothing else. We'll know a little bit about Michi's music because we can listen to other pieces that she's written. But the first thing we have to do is spend some time, each of us, with the score. We're singing the parts in our head, experimenting on our instruments, coming up with ideas that we bring to rehearsal. And every one of us is going to bring different ideas, and we're going to try them all out, and we're going to see which ones feel right as we kind of work through it. It's kind of an amazing process. I mean, what I love about chamber music is that no one has authority. At least chamber music in the 20th century, 21st century, is a sort of old-fashioned approach where the first violinist led. But in this case, we each get to kind of talk about what we believe the tempo should be, the color of the sound, the articulations, and it's like a grand experiment. And I think bringing all those ideas and having all of them be valid from the beginning leads to a richer interpretation of the piece. And I think also the beautiful thing is you can change that interpretation as you go. I mean, if one performance you do it this way, the next one you can try a different thing. And that certainly happened with the most recent commission we did from a composer in Boston named Kati Agoch. I feel like we played her piece, her string quartet, which is called Imprimatur, maybe a dozen times already, and the way we've played it has evolved as we've kind of lived with it. So that's really nice. Zach D. Any advice for relaxing while playing? When I'm stuck in technically demanding parts, my shoulders lock up and I tire easily in my right arm. Well, Zach, that's a big topic. Is it mostly your right arm? One thing that you should know is that the hands communicate with each other. So if the left hand is doing something really technically difficult, that tension sort of necessarily translates into the bow. So the first thing I would do, Zach, is actually practice the bow without the difficulty of the left hand. And I would practice with big free gestures so that the beginnings of your strokes in the passage, I don't know which passages you're talking about specifically, but I feel like the bigger the initial impulse of the stroke is, the more room there is for relaxation afterwards. The analogy that I often use for my students is, when you think about how something rebounds or how you get, let's take a basketball, how you get a ball to bounce very high. I mean, that involves a lot of initial throwing of the ball, tossing the ball down to the ground, and then you get some free action out of the ball. It bounces back. And I think the more that you are free physically at the beginnings of the strokes, the more your muscles have the chance to give you some relaxation and free motion afterwards. So without spending a huge amount of time trying to figure out what your specific issue is, I would first try the exercise of separating the hands and making sure that the bow arm stays loose and free without the difficulties. And then add the left hand in slowly and keep your focus on the freedom of the right hand. If the right hand is playing rhythmically and freely with lots of rebound and release, the left hand can do the same thing. The hands can work together that way. I would also, Zach, make sure that you're feeling that your bow arm is connected all the way into your back, so that you're not still here. Because when you're stiff and tight in your lower back and your hips, then you don't have a free range of motion here. So your bow bow stroke should be always led first from the way your back and your upper body moves. And I think we can think of how when we walk, the arms swing naturally and they're not locked in place. So you want to figure out the connection between the way your arms can swing and the way you move. It's difficult as cellists because our butts are stuck in a chair. But if you use your feet to push off the ground, you can sort of simulate this idea of walking. And that can translate into a really free bow stroke. Now that doesn't get you to your difficult technical passage, but I would start there. And then once you feel loose there, I would begin to increase the difficulty of the left hand. Question from Samantha. What advice can you give to young quartets in terms of rehearsal efficiency and making decisions on musical ideas? Wow, that's a great question. The first thing I would say is try the idea before you criticize it. So the fastest way to solidifying your voice as a quartet is to just play the idea first, listen to the idea, try to understand what the person is saying, ask questions, and then try to embody what they're asking you to do. I think the second that we start to challenge an idea before we've really tried it, it's not conducive to productive rehearsal, and it slows things down. I mean, we're as much guilty of this as anybody. I mean, when we first started out, we're all strong musical personalities, and we really thought we knew how a piece should go, but you really learn to appreciate what your colleagues have to offer and respect their ideas, and you don't have to make firm decisions right away. I think that's the other thing that quartets feel, that they get to rehearsal and they're like, okay, is this down bow or up bow? You don't have to decide that right away. Are we playing this at quarter note equals 80 or quarter note equals 86? You don't have to decide that. You need to play and listen, and the piece will start to take some shape. I think you have to be patient with each other and be willing to really try the idea, and exaggerate might not be the right word, but really embody it and build upon the idea. And eventually I found that, at first, if I feel my gut reaction is, oh, that idea is awful, I feel once I really live with it for even a day or a couple days, I start to feel like, oh, I understand it now. And it starts to feel like my own idea, and I can incorporate it and add on to it. And it's like a lot of people talk about string quartet rehearsal like improv comedy, where you whatever absurd thing anybody does on stage, you take it and you build upon it. My wife and I were watching this amazing Netflix improv comedy duo, and now their name is escaping me. Schwartz and somebody. Anyway, these two guys who do stand-up long form improv comedy, and they do the most bizarre stuff, and they never negate what the person is doing. So they build this kind of story for an hour on stage, all improv. And it was inspiring as a quartet musician to watch them do that, because even in a performance, you might have something spontaneous happen from a colleague, and you want to react to it and build on it. And I think that when you can get to that place, which is very difficult, I mean, it's a lifelong work, it's a very fulfilling. Okay, I'm falling behind here. Questions are coming in. Question from Paula in Santa Cruz. How do you provide a better foundation to your quartet sound as the cello player? I have always struggled with balance, when to play more or less. Well, that's a great question, Paula. The most important thing is your ears, obviously. I mean that I don't mean for that to sound trite, but I think we can all, myself included, listen more deeply all the time. I think if you kind of distill what being a really great musician is, it's about really great listening, whether it's to yourself, others. I think the more you can make sure that you're really hearing what you believe you want to hear, the chances that that's going out into the audience the way you want is probably higher. Now, when you're providing foundation in a bass line, I think you have room to give good support. But if you feel like you're not a good judge, a lot of times what we do in our quartet is we send somebody out. We send one of the four of us out in front of the quartet, and we see if what we think we're doing is actually coming across. And the more you do that, the more you give yourself feedback from one colleague to the other three, the more you begin to kind of develop your quartet sound, and the more you feel like you understand how loud or soft you can play. But I would also say, Paula, that it's not just about loud or soft. It's also about kind of quality of sound. So there's a way, even when you're trying to balance carefully, that you can provide a kind of harmonic core in the bass. So I would experiment not only with volume, but I would experiment with the color in the sound, because there's that's as important, if not, that's probably more important. Question from Alonso. Any advice or comment on left-hand pits while playing a sustained note vibrato? Oh my God, I never have to do that. So you're talking about trying to keep a note vibrating while pitching an open string. You know, I ran into this with one of my students recently, playing a Ned Rorem piece. Yuping, if you're out there, maybe you can answer this question. Let's think. I don't know what exactly you're trying to pitch. Hopefully it's an open string. It should be pretty easy if it's an open string to keep this motion constant and this flick a separate motion. I do believe that if you can develop a way of the vibrato and the left hand working together so that the action of putting the finger down is connected to the vibrato, that might be part of the solution for you. So when I put my finger down on the cello, that action is the kind of ignition or spark that starts the vibrato. So this rotation that I can do with my forearm, like I'm opening a door, turning a doorknob, that rotation I think is essential to how we put our fingers down in the cello. I think if you put your fingers down without action here, which is how we learn to play when we're younger, it's less flexible. And then the vibrato and the finger action are two separate things. But I think if you can figure out how the act of placing your finger ignites or sparks the vibrato motion, then you're maybe part of the way there to solving that problem. I'm sort of guessing because I don't know exactly the passage you're talking about. The other way you can think about this is, it's easier probably to do it when you put a finger down, but when you pick a finger up, a lot of people practice with a left-hand pizzicato as a way to spark the vibrato going the other direction. So I'm playing with really active turning, or actually my teacher, Tim Eddy, called this toggling. That was his favorite word for that. That sort of connects this part of the arm to the fingers. And it makes your fingers stronger, and it makes the vibrato more flexible. So I think if you can figure out how to maybe use that technique, maybe that will help. Sorry, Alonso. I don't know if that exactly addresses your question. Stephen Grant Vetter. Hi, Daniel. How do you approach the complexity of shifts from a body perspective and in relationship to the bow? How do you approach the complexity of shifts from a body perspective and in relationship to the bow? Well, I often think about the way that the bow can conduct the left side of the body. I think there's a timing in the way that you shift. Again, this relates to the hands working together. And I think if you think about the shift being rhythmic and prepared, that both hands are related to each other. And it helps me when I'm trying to execute a shift to make sure that I'm feeling that shift both in the right and the left side of the body. I don't know if that is exactly what you're asking, but I do think, like I was speaking about with the previous cellist, that the relationship between the hands is so crucial that if you are having trouble with the left side, if you think about the right side, it sometimes can make something click on the other. Hey Keegan, how's it going? What are your recommendations for daily warm-ups? I have so many. I mean, that's a topic for a whole CelloChat. I've been recently really loving this book. I don't know if you guys know that book. I feel like it, in a single volume, it manages to combine a lot of the things that I was doing, from Sevchek to some Galamian stuff, Kosman. So it has a lot of what I need in one book. But I always start out my day with just very simple things. I mean, I think we should treat our scales not just as exercises for playing the left hand with agility. I think we should treat the scales as an opportunity to play beautifully with the bow also. I think every time we are kind of separating the left hand technique from music making, we're not really helping ourselves. So even when I do technical exercises, I'm still paying attention to the quality of my sound, the beauty of my vibrato. I'm not just isolating the left hand in a vacuum, because I never play that way on stage. So I don't really subscribe to the idea that you should just kind of drill the left hand like a robot, because that's never something that I do when I'm nervous. And I want everything that I do when I practice the cello to be musical. So I try not to divorce that, even if I'm doing a very simple exercise. So I do all the standard things, Keegan. I do, scales with a variety of fingerings, kind of fast, agile fingering, slow, cantabile fingerings, multiple notes per bow, arpeggios, octaves, thirds, sixths, fourths, chromatic sixths, mixed double stops, the thumb position scales, where I'm sort of learning the positions of scales up here, shifting exercises, vibrato exercises. I think, if you believe like I do that music and technique should never be separated, I think you can still find, it actually allows you to find some joy in that technique work, so it doesn't really feel like a grind. But I think it's crucial. I think some large percentage of your daily practice should be devoted to that kind of work. Okay, falling behind. Question from Ellen. What do you think are the basic technical requirements for studying the cello at a university? I think I can speak for our school, I guess, because that's where I have the most experience. I think you need to be able to play a popper etude. I think you need to be at the level of maybe even one of the easier poppers would be a good gauge for kind of where your technique should be. I think standard concerto first movement is great. We've heard some quote-unquote student concertos. They're not even student concertos, but something like Kabalevsky, or sort of, the concertos that we think about as sort of stepping stones to the Schumann and Dvorak and Shostakovich concerti. Kabalevsky, Lalo, Saint-Saëns, they all demonstrate enough technical ability, I think. But in the end, we're able to identify qualities in a cellist that we think people need. I mean, whether they have a kind of musical sensibility, and if they have a deep musical sensibility and their cello technique is not quite caught up to it, I mean, and they seem like they're teachable in that regard, I mean, this is a wonderful thing. I think it's a balance of kind of natural musicianship, cello proficiency. I hope that answers your question. Do you have any exercises? This is from Julia. Do you have any exercises to get control of your vibrato? I have understood the foundations, but my arm has a tendency to vibrate faster than I intend. Now, that's a really good question. I think it's really important when you start learning vibrato to start big and wide and slow. And I think that when it's fast, it's because there's tension, and the arm is not allowed to make as big of an oscillation as you probably want it to do because the muscles are seizing up. So I think you want to start with very basic flexing exercises where you're developing, I don't know if you can see, but you're developing a kind of flexibility in the finger joints. And you're starting sort of at the pitch and pulling back from the pitch. And you want to do it pretty rhythmically so that you feel like there's a pulse that's guiding the vibrato. Eventually, I think that sort of exact pulsation will fade away, but at the beginning you want to try various rhythms, triplets, sextuplets, until it's sort of wide and fast. Because I think what you don't want, I mean, sometimes you want narrow and fast, but I think you want your basic vibrato to be loose and wide, and then you can sort of bring it into focus when you want to without tension that way. I think, you know, a lot of people have a sort of stiff finger oscillation this way, where the finger is really stiff and you just sort of rotate around it this way. And that's also, I think, a little bit too basic. I think you want to make sure that you're flexing the finger in your practice. And that you're angling a little bit not perpendicular to the board. Because I think when you do that, you also limit your range of motion. When I feel open here, I think it allows my shoulder to move a little bit. It allows more flexibility here. The second that I kind of close off and just shake with a stiff finger and a forearm rotation, I don't feel loose here. So you want to make sure that you're open to the cello and that you have very loose finger joints when you do it. I hope that helps. I would go back and just really slow it down that way. What are a few core principles you encourage your students to focus on in the practice room? That's a good question. I already addressed one of them, which is to never practice your technique in a vacuum, to always think about shape, tone, musical aspects of it. I also am encouraging my students to develop a routine. I mean, I think that, you know, the earlier you can get in the habit of practicing, addicted is maybe not the right word, but I certainly had that experience where, you know, like some people are addicted to exercise, you know, that the endorphins that exercise produces makes them feel good. And if they skip their morning jog, they kind of feel cruddy about themselves the rest of the day. I suggest you kind of get yourself to a place where you feel like that way about your practicing. That if you're really at the stage where you need to put hours into developing your technique, I would make a routine. I would make a practice chart. I would make a schedule, and I would stick to it. And I would just when your practice time is over and you feel like, oh, I didn't really make progress. That's okay. Like, learning is not, a straight line up. So I think I even notice with my students that, every once in a while they'll do a kind of bump and something clicks. And you never know when that's going to happen. But I think the routine of kind of sticking to your schedule, this much technique work, this much of your Saint-Saëns concerto, this much of your Bach 2, and isolating the spots you need to work on, doing it always with a musical intention, always with pulse, always with a beautiful sound. I can't emphasize enough also the feeling of practicing with pulse. I think when we think about an athlete, for example, who has to execute something like, for example, a free throw, like somebody on a basketball team who has to make a free throw under pressure, thousands of fans screaming, and they just have to do this motion. They always do it with rhythm. They always have the same number of bounces in the ball. They set, they shoot. I mean, I'm not a basketball expert, but I think when I watch athletes, I recognize that the rhythm of their body helps them learn a difficult task or execute something very specific. The other thing that they have to do is they have to visualize or imagine what's going to happen when they execute it. So always leading with your mind's ear, hearing what you want it to sound like before you do it. That's another thing that I can't stress enough to my students. So everything should be practiced with an inner pulse. Until you develop that inner pulse, the metronome should be your best friend. The metronome is there to teach you how to have an inner pulse. It's not there to tell you where to play. It's to teach you to feel the pulse yourself. And when you develop that inner pulse, it makes the physical aspect of playing the cello easier. Hey, Sarah. How do you manage having so many technical exercises available and prioritizing them without letting other techniques be ignored? Lately, if I don't time myself, I'll spend an entire day on technique. Thank you for your time. Well, I guess that's a good problem if you have so many things and you don't get tired of practicing them. I first of all, Sarah, I would be very surgical in what you think you need. You should identify something in the repertoire that's difficult for you. If there's a passage in your concerto that's hard, I would sort of identify what the problem is in that concerto. Maybe it's a passage of octaves or thirds. And then I would go and make your technique work about that. You don't have to do everything every day, but I think kind of consistent good work on what is problematic in your repertoire is really useful. And then you can kind of rotate something else in after a week or so once you're feeling better about it. And I would make your technique work slightly more difficult than your concerto, right? So I would make the passage that's giving you trouble in Dvorak concerto not the hardest thing that you're doing in your technique work. I would stretch your technique work a little bit beyond what you have to execute. So make exercises for yourself, that challenge your left hand to do what it needs to do in a concerto, for example. Sort of think about the range of, say, the octaves you have to play and stretch that out a little bit further, or add rhythms to it. I think this is a crucial thing, change the rhythm to make it more difficult. It will make playing that passage easier. But knowing you, Sarah, I can imagine that you're really going all in on your technique work, which is great. But just make sure that you're enjoying it all the time. Let's see. Jackie. Hey, Jackie, how's it going? My question, for a chamber group that is preparing for a competition, what are some tips for practicing as a group besides running through the pieces when you're coming closer to the competition? Just like in your solo repertoire, I think playing slowly as a quartet is really useful. I mean, when you slow something down um, right before you need to play it, it allows your ears to kind of adapt and hear. I would, I mean, I think I would encourage you to do that. I would also encourage you when you're preparing for a competition to treat it like a performance, so that you don't get into the mindset of being judged. That's something that we all deal with all the time. Um, but I feel like when I'm on stage, um, not in a competitive setting, which thankfully is I don't have to do anymore. Um, that there's more of an attitude of sharing, more of an attitude of being with the audience and kind of sharing this music with them, sharing kind of the human experience through Beethoven with them. And that's just a more positive way to think. And it makes you play better. So when we were doing competitions early in our career, that was something that we constantly reminded ourselves of. We tried. I mean, it's very hard. Um, but we would be backstage at the Banff competition, and we would say, well, let's play for our parents. You know, we knew that our parents were somewhere in the back of the audience, behind the judges, and so we tried to remind ourselves that they were here for the music. You know, they were here to support us. So I would encourage you to practice getting into that mindset and not get too obsessed with trying to play perfectly, because I think the second that we try to play perfectly, we sort of seize up. But when we turn our attention to making something beautiful, um, at least for me, I'm more successful. Play really relaxed is maybe the most important thing I can give somebody. Um, and I think every cellist has to go through that process of figuring out what it means to really play relaxed. And I mean, let's face it, it's, at least for me, it's a lifelong process, right? I'm constantly asking myself, can I be even more relaxed? If something's not working, I I try to figure out if there's something about my physical being that's tightening up. Um, so I would encourage students to kind of develop a body awareness. I mean, taking Alexander technique was really helpful for me. I mean, it made me kind of listen to my body in a way that I hadn't done before. So it's sort of related to deepening your listening here. You sort of deepen your sensation, your ability to feel how you're playing. And what's wonderful about the cello is when you do relax and get rid of all your tension, the quality of the sound is better and the execution is easier. So that's the first most important thing, I would say. Um, and then the other deficit that I really see, I guess, um, is a lack of attention to the bow. I think I was the same way when I was young. There's a kind of obsession with the left hand. I mean, when you think about it, it's busier. I mean, it has more to do, um, and oftentimes our attention to the left hand makes the bow hand suffer. So I see more often a lot of underdeveloped bows compared to the left hand in students, and I think that our artistry comes in through the bow arm and through the bow hand, and the subtleties and nuances that we can develop here are so crucial to what we're able to do um, in making beautiful music. So I would encourage you to make sure that you're not starving your bow hand of attention when you're practicing, because it's your voice in the end, right there. Can you recall a specific piece of advice from any of your teachers that has proved to be particularly impactful throughout your career? I cannot. I mean, it's so much. it's hard to it's hard to pick one. Um, But one thing that I love is that when I find myself teaching, I'm so often referencing things that my teachers told me. I think that thinking back to how Tim would talk about Pablo Casals, and now I talk about Tim, and it's just a wonderful thing that there's this tradition of cello playing that's being shared, and all of this technical advice is being musical and technical advice is being passed down through these generations. I just think it's a beautiful thing, and I think about this a lot. Question from Robert. Hello. Do you have any suggestions on how to play something in front of your teacher the way you often play it in practice, which is always better? It's very frustrating. Yeah, I was so scared to play in my lessons sometimes, and it never went as well as I wanted it to. You know, that's a very common problem, and the thing that makes performing easier is repetition. So I still get nervous when I perform on stage, but I found that just making myself do it, making sure that I get up there and do it makes it easier. There's no shortcut, really. There's no way to kind of predict what it's going to feel like. But like anything else, the more experience you have, the easier it gets. So I would encourage all of you to play for people as much as you can, because it's a different sensation, and you learn kind of what happens to your body when you get nervous. Our bodies all do strange things when we have adrenaline. So part of the lessons we can take away from performing is what happened when I was on stage, and how do I control it next time? What are the techniques I can do to try to get myself into a state where I'm playing the way I play in my practice room? Because it really that's what it's about. It's about feeling judged by your teacher, and wanting to do your best and show all the hard work that you're doing. But unfortunately, because we have egos, the moment that we worry about what someone else thinks about us, we get, physical reactions, responses in our muscles that aren't good for cello playing. So again, like I said to Jackie, that if you can focus on the beauty of the music, what you want to say, deepening your listening, and turn off the side of your brain that's thinking things like, oh God, what is he going to say to me? Or she's going to be so upset. She's going to think I didn't practice. You got to turn that part of your brain off, because that part of your brain is not helping you play the way you want to play. And that's a skill. I mean, that's a skill that I'm still working on, making that judgment side of your brain quiet for a little while. I hope that helps. Question from Grisha. I hope I'm saying that correctly. How does one have a good vibrato? Is it with the whole arm or just the hand and fingers? Well, we talked a little bit about vibrato already. I think it's with the whole arm, in a sense, in that every joint, every spring in your arm, the shoulder, the elbow, the wrist, and especially the fingers, they all have to be flexible. They all have to be able to move a little bit. So when I'm vibrating, I'm making sure that my finger is strong in its shape. It's an arch and it's strong, but the flexibility of the joint is still enabled. So the second that I squeeze up with my thumb, it cuts off the flexibility in the fingers. So I'm hanging on the cello this way, and you can even see that I'm able to kind of do this swinging motion with my elbow. And I'm making sure that the hand is small, that I don't have any extensions or fingers pointing out in weird directions, because that creates tension also. So the hand is loose and small. The primary motion is probably this rotation here, but it's also important to develop a kind of ability to pull back on the note, this sort of backwards circle this way. So as I was talking to a previous cellist on this chat, this rotation here where I feel like I'm drawing a little circle with my elbow. So all of that will teach you to have flexibility. And then the most important thing, Grisha, is to have the sound that you want in your ear. I think if you have a very specific idea of what you want your vibrato to sound like, and you try to find that physically, then it's gonna get there. It's gonna take some patience and practice. But start slow, start wide, start loose. Don't press up with your thumb. Don't have any extensions in your fingers. Everything is small. Everything is small. Here's Keegan. Thank you very much for answering my question. If you have time for more vibrato exercise demonstrations, that would be helpful. Okay, so we discussed the one where you do rhythmic, I don't know what you call this, like a siren exercise. I'm always trying to return to the fundamental pitch and pull back from it, because I believe that vibrato should be below the note, back to the note. I don't think it should go above the pitch. The other vibrato exercise that I really think is useful is picking a very beautiful resonant note on your cello. Maybe it's G. And making sure that when you substitute fingers, that the vibrato stays constant and that the sound doesn't change. So I think we want to make sure that we don't have a kind of weak link in our four fingers. I mean, the thumb, I have a horrible thumb vibrato. I don't have a thumb vibrato, but most people don't. That you don't get to your fourth finger and feel like it's not doing what you want it to do. I mean, of course, we all have our favorite fingers, and when we can use them, we try to use them, but sometimes we have no choice. So you want to make sure that you develop a fourth finger vibrato that sounds as wide as your second. And for me, that means a slightly different technique. I mean, I have a slightly flatter fourth finger because I need to get more weight into it, and I need to be able to pull it back further. So, I mean, essentially, Keegan, that's an ear exercise. That's me starting with my favorite finger and figuring out, what do I need to do? What do I need to do with my other fingers to match my best finger? That's the other exercise that I would suggest. And then maybe the last one, which I find really useful if somebody has a tight vibrato. I would do an exercise where you actually allow the vibrato to just peter out by itself. So you could imagine, like, you start the vibrato and the oscillations sort of die by themselves. So in my scale work, I'm doing a really big motion and then a huge diminuendo, and letting the vibrato just naturally come to a close. So the biggest point of oscillation is the very beginning of the note. Again, I'm putting a lot of energy into the start of the note, both in the bow and the left hand. I think you have to do it on both sides for it to feel good at first. Eventually, you can learn to separate the bow from the left hand, but at the beginning, I really think you want to do both together. You can see that I'm putting energy and letting it dissipate. So this is making sure that throughout the course of the note, I'm not actively pumping the vibrato, right? I want you to see how many shakes you can get before you tighten up. I mean, at first, I think a lot of my students, they get about that many. And that's okay. Eventually, you'll get more oscillations for free. You know, you do an initial amount of intense energy, and then you let it shake out. We have a couple more questions. What are your ways to find out? Hi, Naichen. What are your ways to find out your own sound and personality when approaching a new piece, which already had tons of recording. For instance, the second theme of the first movement from Dvorak's Cello Concerto. That's a beautiful theme. I would start Night by singing it. I think no one has your voice. No one is able to sing the way you sing. And there's so many kind of technical hurdles that we address at the cello that get in the way of how we kind of hear a phrase, how we want to shape it. And when you're singing it, you're not just kind of, you're not just singing it for, I don't know, the beauty of the phrase. You're listening very carefully to what kinds of consonances you believe should be at the beginning of what kind of sound do you put in your teeth? How do you use your tongue? All those things translate into your bow. How much articulation do you do? Does this note grow? How specific can you think about all your tools of expression? How the notes develop in your voice? Where you breathe. I mean, how long is the phrase before you feel like you want to actually take a breath, right? And all of that comes into the cello. And I think if you do that, you'll have a very honest vision, lack of a better word, of how the phrase should go. And I think it won't feel like it belongs to somebody else. I think it will have come from you if you start by singing. I think this is so important for so much of the music that we do, that we play on the cello. With that being said, I encourage you to learn from other people. There's no way that you're going to play it the same way as Dupre and Yo-Yo and all these people that have these wonderful recordings. It's just not possible. So don't worry about it. Find out what you think is beautiful that they did and make it your own. There's no shame in that. Antonio, thank you for hosting this wonderful cello chat and for your wonderful advice. Who is the maker of your instrument? I have a sort of unusual cello from the 1930s. It's made by Henel, Haenel, who worked in Toronto and actually later in the United States. It's I don't know if you can see it, but some people have told me it's a Grafiller model. It's not a fancy cello, but it's good enough for me, I guess. I wish I was richer. Ariana, what do you suggest practicing every day? I suggest practicing long tones every day. I suggest starting out before you do anything and finding your favorite note on the cello and listening for resonance. See how many other strings you can get to ring, and then begin to connect so that you're just falling in love with the beauty of the sound that you can make. And then as you get more comfortable, you can begin to take these long tones and make more different kinds of sounds. I think if you practice every day, the palette of sound color that you want to have, that you want to bring to your repertoire, you don't want to be a painter that has only primary colors or only 12 colors. I mean, you want to have, dozens of colors at your disposal, right? And you have so many different tools to tweak to get those colors on your palette, right? You have articulation, you have contact point, you have bow speed. So challenge yourself every day to find specificity in the color that you can make at the cello. And those things are all related. The vibrato is related to the bow, the contact point is related to the weight and the speed. So everything is sort of changing. All the dials are moving with each other as you experiment. But I would say spend 5-10 minutes before you start playing hard music on your cello, just falling in love with the color of the sound that you can make. I don't know, I just made that up maybe. Let's see. Question from Juan. What is the secret of falsetto bow in the 7 do pour? It's very difficult for staccato in 3 notes or more. Sorry, I'm not exactly sure what stroke you're talking about. Can you type in what you mean? Are you talking about like a staccato this way? Where you have staccato notes on a single bow? This way? Or we'll wait for Juan to clarify if he can. I don't have... That's what you're talking about. Okay. So I would make sure that you're paying attention to the angle of the bow, that you have your arm weight directed into the first finger. So you can kind of wiggle the string. And then it's actually more of a release than it is an action. So you sort of load the weight and then you release the string. I'm sorry, I don't have do pour 7 in my ear. I don't know how it goes. But so I would start very slowly this way, right? So that before you pull, you load the weight. Load, 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 load. This way. And the angle of the bow matters, because if the angle of the bow is not good, you're not going to get a nice articulation. So I would start with that. You have to have flexible fingers. And I would make sure that you're also engaging these 3 fingers. I mean, don't just rely on the first finger. I think you want to make sure that you have all the fingers on the bow. This way. And I hope that helps. It's about finding the release in between the strokes. Because with a staccato stroke like that, the tendency is just to seize up and hope for the best. But I don't think that's the solution. I don't have that good of a bow staccato, so you should probably ask somebody else. But question: how do you change between strings? For example, C and D, so the middle string doesn't sound. Are you talking about on separate bows or on the same bow? Well, certainly, if you're taking a different bow. Certainly, if you're taking a new bow, you just want to make sure that you get to the height of the new string before you play. If it's on the same bow, you have to kind of fake it. I mean, there's no way to really play legato if you're skipping a string, I think. So if it's a beautiful cantabile passage, you probably don't want that skipped string. You probably want to look for a different fingering. But I think the most important thing is to make sure that the bow is not traveling sideways while it's on the angle of the G string, right? You have to wait until the bow has stopped moving and then move it, and then move it again. Practice it slowly. I think it'll help. Okay. Hello from Peru. How can I improve the mastery of my bow for smoother slurs and bow changes? This is from Isabella. So this is a big topic. The one thing I would say, Isabella, is to not think about your bow stroke as being only side to side. Make sure that you think about your bow stroke as having dimension up and down and also out. So the way that we change our bow is not on this 2-dimensional plane that goes side to side. So to exaggerate for you what I mean is when I make a bow change, you can see that I kind of rise up and fall down. see that it almost draws this figure eight like shape. So when I'm making a change like that, there's more continuity to the change. It feels like there's less angularity to the changes, because my arm stays in motion. My arm never really stops. My arm stays ahead of the bow stick this way. Does that make sense? So one way you can practice this, Isabella, is by practicing a waving motion on one string, and then timing the bow change with the wave. This way. So you figure out how to time your bow change with the crest of the wave, and then you can flatten out the wave so that you really just have kind of one wave per bow. I hope that helps. I mean, listen, this is like, several lessons worth of work. What's your practice routine post long tones? Oh, after I do my long tones. Well, I mentioned earlier in the chat that I do all kinds of technique work. I talked to Sarah about being surgical and isolating what her repertoire needs and doing exercises this way, very specific to the difficulties of the music that she's playing. But scales, thirds, sixths, octaves, fourths, shifting exercises, vibrato exercises. I mean, anything that involves, anything you can think of that you need to do at the cello, you need to have exercises for. Same finger shifts, shifts from a higher finger to a lower finger, shifts from a lower finger to a higher finger. I mean, there's so much. Thumb position exercises. You should get a exercise book, a comprehensive exercise book, and see how much there is in it. Okay, I think that marks the end of the questions. If you can give any closing remarks. Well, I mean, this is my first time doing this. It's been a lot of fun. I hope that it's been useful. Certainly it's good to spend some time with cellists. I wish I could see you and get some of your reactions, and I hope what I said was clear. It's hard to kind of just talk and not get feedback as a teacher, but I hope what I said was useful, and if you need clarifying questions, you can find me on the university website or at the Jupiter Quartet website, and I'm happy to try to help you. But I hope that everybody's staying healthy and using music as a way of reaching out to people in these really tough times, both with the COVID crisis and also all of the racial injustice that we're witnessing. So last night I just went out onto my screened-in porch because it was so hot in my house, and I just played Bach. It just felt like I needed to play some Bach, and people were walking by on the street and listening, and it was just a way of kind of being with people, even though I can't actually be with them right now. So find ways to try to connect through music. I think it's really important, and I hope that you have continued success in all your practicing.